on, Blondie. Come here. Come here. Hi, I am K.N.Fitzwater, and this is Blondie. Blondie is a sister to Squeaker, if you have been following my channel. She's the eldest cat in the... yeah, that's my phone. She's the eldest sibling of the litter, and she's also the smallest of them all. She is a champagne tabby. And today we're going to talk about dark fantasy, what it is, and my thoughts on it. I have written a story in this genre. I have read everyone else's books in this genre, and for some reason everyone has a hard time defining this. And I want to let you all know what this definition is. For some reason, everyone goes to this definition of, I know it when I see it. And that's not good enough. So I'm going to help break it down to you. What is dark fantasy? Let's start with the fantasy context, because we all know fantasy. Fantasy is about magic. Magic in the real world, magic in a fictional world, magic we either can know and describe and have a system for it, or magic that we don't know, but it's powerful, mystical, wicked, unusual, whatever you call it. Sometimes the protagonist is magical, sometimes the protagonist uses magic, or the protagonist has to deal with magic at some point in their adventure, in their natural environment. Maybe their world is magical, but everyone else is not. That is fantasy. That is the context. Sometimes it deals with other elements from the horror genre, and sometimes the horror genre steals from the fantasy context. There is a little bit of an overlap. That comes from Robert E. Howard and Lovecraft. They are contemporaries in the 1930s and 40s, where they created pretty much the horror, the weird horror, and the unusual horror, and the kind of sword and sorcery fantasy genres. They both came from the horror magazine back then. Even though we called George R. R. Martin and Joe Abercrombie kind of the founders of dark fantasy genre, I believe that our dark fantasy genre comes from Lovecraft and from Robert E. Howard. Their books and the items that they talk about are very similar and very close to the core of what we go into. But I think that Joe Abercrombie and George R. R. Martin is able to make it for what it is as a staple name and able to revive it as its own separate category. So dark fantasy has magic, has fantastical elements to it, and we're dealing with supernatural elements sometimes. It can be done in an urban setting, it can be done in a low setting, it can be done in a high setting, etc. But there is one thing that we are that makes us dark fantasy. No, it's not boobs, it's not violence, it's not gore. It's humanity. Specifically, the darker elements of humanity. That's probably why you're able to see it and you can recognize it as it is. You know it when you see it, because it's theme. And I think that's why it's so hard to define it, because it is theme. Theme is very broad. It deals about the morale of the story. theme is a little bit more than just man versus nature. Themes about what would you do as a human in this context. The reason why you're able to see it as a dark fantasy book is simply because we explore the darker elements of humanity. Violence, lust, betrayal, grief, disaster. We explore those things. Oh yes, and horror. We get into that in a short little time. We explore all these elements. And oh, that's her leaving. Okay, Blondie. Okay, bye-bye. Okay, so we explore those type of things. What do we do in a crisis? What do we do if we lose the war? What do we do when you have an abomination and there are a group of people? Are there really abominations? What do you do in a political scheme for the throne when you have magic and dragons? What do you do when you are a necromancer that's able to raise the dead and you have a missing father? And what you do is considered taboo, but you want to do it for the good of all. So that's interesting. So there's exploration that we do in this darker fantasy context. We're not bad people when we write this stuff. We don't enjoy violence. We don't enjoy the gore. We don't enjoy, the sex scenes. I personally have a hard time with sex scenes. And we explore them because sometimes we see it on the news. When there's a crisis, some people go out to help others. Other people go and loot the stores. We focus more on the heroes helping and saving people, but then we go and take a turn like, well, why are people looting the stores? Why are they hurting other people during this disaster? Why are they not doing this? So we look at it. We look at the nature of the person that go into the store. Maybe they're not a good person. Maybe they think that they deserve it, or maybe they are pushed to an extreme that they have no choice. So we kind of focus on that. That's what we do. We explore the type of people that would do these horrible things. We explore the scary, dark stuff in our mythology, like demons and ghosts and things that will feast upon you. Things that terrify us, and we explore why does it terrify us, and bring that into our stories. Or maybe we don't explain why, we just simply just put it in there because that is the world they deal with. Those bumps in the night that we're afraid of, they're real. We explore that sometimes. Or we put it on its head saying, oh, they're not evil or horrible, they're actually good beings, we're the monsters. That's what we explore, that's what we do, that's the genre. We explore theme. There are two ways to go about theme in a book. It has nothing to deal with setting, has nothing to deal with characters. It deals about tone and mood, which will help explain about a subcategory called grimdark. Mood and tone. Mood is about how one feels about a situation. Think about mood lighting. There are different emotions and reactions with color, and there are different emotions and reactions dealing with descriptions. That is what mood is, and we showcase it through the characters and how they're feeling and how they're perceiving things. And we do it in the sense of how the ambience is in the environment, kind of like the mood that the general population is giving off. For instance, if a character is terrified of a walking creature that shouldn't be walking because it is an abomination, ideally you as an audience would feel that too, because you are reading the emotions and the blow by blows about how their heart is racing, their palms are sweaty. They throw up a little bit in the back of the mouth. Now their throat is burning. They wish they could run, but they can't because their legs are jelly, So you could go on and on. You go into the emotions of the character or the surrounding environment. Tone is a little bit different. Tone is how we go about describing objects, environments, and people. Their take on the world, what they're focused on, what they perceive it, how they perceive it. For instance, I may see a red brick building as something pristine or clean. There's no grit at all in the motors. It's really nice and shiny. It's just, it just got done. You kind of have a picture of a nice razor sharp brick house. Take it to like 50 years later, you see moss in between the motors. You see some of the bricks have cracked and crumbled. There is weeds sprouting out. The windows are so dingy you can't see through them. You see wood rot in the frames. The gutter is falling down. So you kind of have an image of, okay, this brick house is dilapidated. It needs a lot more than TLC. It may need a home inspection. You kind of see what the tone is here. This is not a safe place. Compared to a normal, freshly constructed brick home, you think of, new beginnings, house may be filled with love, new. So Grimdark talks about the grittiness of the world, how grim everyone else is. It's not a pretty picture. The world is out there to get you, or really don't care about you. The populace really don't care or are dealing with their own issues. You kind of have a tyrannical or a Wild West kind of feel to it. You have characters that are morally ambiguous. You may have a protagonist that really don't care about, how violent or gore-tastic it is. It really depends on what they consider normal, and they consider, that type of environment normal. The author focus on this gritty, grim, dark aspect of this world environment and the characters to showcase to you that the real world is, just as gritty and dark as this. We don't have rose-colored shades. We probably could look around in our home environment and be like, oh, it's almost as bad as this here. And it's a nice, interesting take. How far have we come from this George R.R. Martin world? Are we really stooping to the same level as they would? Are we just only one step away from cutting off heads and putting them on pikes? Are we really that far from where we considered sexual assault a normal thing? How far have we come, and how far do we still have to go from the society that George R.R. Martin had presented? It's that realistic. Even though it's set in a fantastical setting, even though it's really dark and brooding, and even though it's very gothic, it does make you step back and think that he took this from a historical perspective and just cast it out there in a fantasy context. And it's possible that we could have this here in our world, because it had happened, and we may go back into this again. That's what I like about the dark fantasy genre, is that it helps you think. I think all literature, whether it's commercial or literature fiction, it helps make you think about what we are as humans, what we are as a society or a group of people. What would we do in these situations? Do we rise up like our heroes, or do we fall down and go below their level? We talked about grimdark. We talked about the theme of dark fantasy. But I'm sure you're there going, how is it different from horror? Because we do still a lot of horror elements in our dark fantasy genre for those who don't go into the grimdark. For those who focus on mood, for those who delve into the supernatural, how are we different from horror? Well, part of it is magic. Part of it is the magical reality of the fantasy setting. There are rituals. You do use spells to get rid of X. You're dealing with a mystical mythos or a mythical creature, even though you're dealing with the horror-tastic of the world. Or maybe the horror is a sorcerer casting off spells that, do horrible, unfathomable things. Or has a dungeon holding magical, unfathomable creatures that really disturb the mind. So it's set in that type of context, and this is one of the reasons why I think Robert E. Howard is one of the fathers of dark fantasy, is because of this kind of context, and that's how we separate ourselves from the horror genre and definition, away from the Lovecraft that is Lovecraft. We're in the perspective of Conan, not this normal little person dealing with this unusual circumstance and just, going crazy and getting out of their mind. Going out of their mind, dealing with something that is terrifying and horrific. Here we're dealing with a kind of a barbarian who has some primal instincts and goes into them. There are moments he did shudder, or is a little bit wary or a little bit scared, but he won't admit it, about some things that are very unusual and questionable and terrifying. But he still tackles them, and he still saves the day, more or less. Somehow, in some way, he comes out on top, or he escapes more or less in one piece. That's what the dark fantasy that delves into mood and doesn't go into the grimdark category, that's kind of what we do. We only have horror elements in our story. We don't really focus on the horror, the terror, the feeling of that story throughout the whole novel. The whole novel isn't about this horror and terror. So I think one of the classic overlaps that we have between fantasy and horror is the core classic horrors, such as Dracula. You have to delve into the Slavic folklore, the Romanian history, and then you have something that is quite magical. This is a supernatural being that's able to live forever, sucking in the bloodlines or blood life of other people, and they magically never die. If you have a normal person drinking blood, they either have really bad indigestion, or they just, get really, really sick. It's a form of cannibalism. People don't get young and beautiful from drinking blood. They don't steal powers from other people. But here we have this vampire that does. That's able to live forever from doing these type of things. And of course, Dracula doesn't stay as his vampire lord self. He's able to transform into a bat or a wolf. So there's a magical element here. So anything dealing with mythos, that's where the lines really blur between horror and fantasy. And it really is up to how the author goes into mood and describe things in their book, how they present it in their story, and how far it goes. There are a few, may not be a few, there are some dark fantasy authors that were placed underneath the horror category just because they go all the way there. All the way to the terror, all the way to the fear aspect of humanity. They just go there. They have some elements of fantasy that put them in kind of a magical or a mythological realm, but they just went all the way there. They haven't pulled back like Robert E. Howard. Those lines do get blurred, and it does happen on the bookshelves when you look for dark fantasy. Sometimes you see it in the horror section other than the normal fantasy section. This is why sometimes Caroline is categorized as a horror children's book, even though it's technically like a dark fantasy book. You're dealing with some evil entity that's supernatural, and she's bartering for her parents' lives, facing this demonic being that looks like her mom. So yes, it does blur. How is it really separate from horror? Really depends on how far we put the fear aspect, the terror aspect in our book. And do we have it where it's throughout the whole story, or is it like it's only in that really weird moment or two in our story? So it also depends on how fantastical and magical the environment is. This is something that is still being explored to this very day. And I'm not surprised that there is some difficulties in separating the two. Grimdark is pretty self-explanatory. It's a gritty world, it's a grim setting. It has its own flavor and text to it. Dark fantasy kind of falls in between the horror and fantasy genres sometimes if you're exploring the theme of terror or mythos. But not all dark fantasy explore that type of thing. There are other themes that we have not really explored that we consider kind of taboo or terrifying, like mental illness or PTSD, depression. We explore those things too. At least I did in my story. Now, another thing that some people have issues with dark fantasy is the explicit content of it. Yes, it is very violent in some cases. The gore really does flow. The blood flows. People are banging everyone everywhere. It's a very dark and gritty world. Sometimes that is thrown in. But if you look at other genres, especially erotica, they have some of that. They have, the explicit sex. Horror has the explicit violence. Sometimes mystery and thrillers have explicit violence. So you do see it in other genres, this explicit context. And some people sometimes will look at a fantasy book and go, oh, if it has sex, if it has gore and violence and death, then yeah, it's grimdark or it's dark fantasy. Sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't. I have read our Savtar's Neverwinter series. And it wasn't really explicit, but there was a lot of sexual activities in with his characters, which is a lot different than what had usually been written in the past books. And that's considered a meat and bread example of, D&D. Of course, this is during the 4.0 D&D, where they're trying to make it more of a grittier environment. He is trying to put that forward, and he did a really good job in showcasing that it was a grittier, darker times for the Forgotten Realms. And even though he wasn't quite as explicit, that context is there, and he wasn't considered a dark fantasy author. I want to say there are other dark fantasy books that did not deal with such explicit body gore or violence or sex, and one of them is Caroline. Caroline is a children's book. Yes, it's in a urban environment. Yes, there is a magical dimension. Yes, there's a demonic entity disguised as her mother, magically stealing children's souls. One may not argue it's fantasy, but no one will argue that there's explicit violence or such adult content. It is a children's book. All I'm saying is that it doesn't need to have that type of context in order to have the genre label. Not everyone is going to be George R. R. Martin or like the TV Game of Thrones series. Not everyone is going to be The Name of the Wind. Not everyone is going to be Joe Abercrombie. Which is fine. It's going to be a rather boring world if we do have every single author in the fantasy context doing that. So as long as an author explores the underbelly of humanity and put it in a magical or a fantastical setting, then it is a dark fantasy genre. It's simply this definition. Dark fantasy explores the darker elements of humanity through mood and tone. So those are my thoughts about dark fantasy and a little bit of grimdark. If you have any questions, let me know. And if you like this type of content, give this a like. Let me know in the comments what you think I need to talk about, if you like this type of stuff. If you don't like this type of stuff, also let me know. I'm more than happy to explore other things that you will prefer. And go ahead and hit subscribe and hit that bell. And I'll talk to y'all later. Bye!